Thank you very much, Peter. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, thanks. So thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel and to join the event. It has been a day full of knowledge, and we are delighted to share from the ILO the recent evidence we have gathered about the impact of COVID-19 on young people. So let me first delve straight into the impacts. What we see, or what we have seen through COVID-19 is that generally young people are always heavily affected and impacted by crises and recessions, but this time is worse. This time we actually see that it's worse because of the size and speed of the impact, but also because of the extent at which COVID-19 has hit young people. And as you just say, Peter, in the case of 30% of young people that have lost their jobs is quite an appalling number. A recent report from the office explains how COVID-19 pushes young people into a three-way shock, a trilemma we call it. First, it disrupts their education and training, and this is naturally caused by the lockdown measures and the inability of young people to continue engaging and learning as before. The second hit, or let's say the second channel of impact is through increased difficulties for young job seekers to transition into decent jobs. And this is, if we think that before COVID-19, there were about 270 million young people not in employment, education, and training. Now, when the pandemic hits and the vacancies are closed, these young people are living a dismal situation in terms of accessing employment. And last, obviously, but not least, and will be most of the focus of my presentation, would be about the impact that the pandemic has had on job and income losses for young workers. Let me just say that before COVID-19 hit, young people were already vulnerable in the labor market. Even though for those that were already working, we know that 3 out of 4 young workers were, for example, in informal economy. And we also know that about 126 million young people were working but living in poverty. So they were not gaining enough to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. And this situation is critical now with the pandemic because naturally being in the informal economy, this makes them, puts them in a situation of great vulnerability. They are do not have access to social protection and have very limited access to health and care services. Many of them are not able to stop working. They are self-employed and these entrepreneurs, survival entrepreneurs, and it is impossible for them to stop working. So this exposure to the pandemic also creates a vicious circle of economic deprivation, poverty, and health issues. It is important also to know that before the pandemic hit, or when the pandemic hit the globe, it found about 178 million young people in those sectors that were hit the hardest. So we see young people in retail, trade, manufacturing, real estate, accommodation, food services, and generally the tourism sector that has been so hardly hit. And this concentration of young workers in these sectors makes the heat of the pandemic particularly discouraging and quite astonishing. So what we see in this table is also the impact on young women. Many of these sectors carry a great proportion of female labor force participation. So when the value chains are broken, then there are significant impacts on the employment of young women. One of the first registered impacts we see naturally is unemployment, and as had been mentioned before, and this is quite important. I have put here just a graph for the European Union 27 countries. It is important to note that we don't yet have global estimates on unemployment for young people after COVID-19. It is a process that has taken time. Many of the labor market statistics or the statistics centers haven't been able to collect data before. So there is a gap in the data, but what I wanted to show here is that what we immediately see is that the youth unemployment rate is growing quite rapidly. And this is important because if anything we have learned from previous crises like the 2008 economic and financial crisis is that youth unemployment is quite elastic and quite responsive to recessions, much more responsive than the adult unemployment rate. And it's not only responsive, but it also has long-term consequences. We see that the long-term unemployment rate of young people increases much faster when there is a recession, but decreases slowly when there is a recovery. So important elements to bear in mind and lessons from the past. Now, during April and May, the ILO and partners of the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth carried out a survey. The survey is called Youth and COVID-19. It's a global survey. We managed to get around 13,000 responses from young people all over the world. And what we see is that about 1 in 6 young people stopped working during at the onset of the pandemic. It is important to highlight here that the most vulnerable of these young people are those that are working in support, clerical support, services, sales, and crafts. But it's also about younger workers, those that are age 18 to 24 have lost their jobs at a much higher rate than those that are 25 or above. It is then with this loss in jobs, it is also important to highlight that there is also a loss in working hours. And as has been said this morning, this is naturally affecting the employment of young people and other workers. And overall, there is a decrease in working hours of 23% from this survey. There are impacts naturally on incomes and productivity. The second element that I want to highlight from this survey and that I think it is important and hope to see the conversation continue with the next speaker is the impact of the pandemic on education and training. So what we see is that 1 in 8 young people across the globe saw their training come to a full stop. Education and training, they could not just continue because the school closed and there was no other option to continue training. This speaks about the digital divide across the globe. Many schools managed to transition into digital opportunities, online or distant learning, others could not. So this left a lot of young people behind. And even for those that managed to transition into some sort of online delivery, they still report in our survey, 75% of them report that they were learning less than before. This situation, let's say this reduction in what they expect to see their education outcomes is important because they actually are seeing their future career prospects with fear and uncertainty. And what we find is that 70% of young people report that they believe their education might be delayed or failed. Now, in all of this, I think it is super important to think about what is the impact on the individual. So we carry out, within the survey, we integrated a module of questions around mental well-being. And what we see is that unfortunately, the pandemic is creating severe risk as regards to the probability of young people to be affected by anxiety and or depression. So globally, 1 out of 6 young people could be facing anxiety and depression, and this is particularly the case for young women and younger youth. So all of these elements to bear in mind because these anxiety and depression probabilities are quite strongly connected to the education and employment impacts of the crisis on young people. This is my last slide, and we have discussed during the morning a lot of different policy solutions and the things that we have tried, as the previous speaker said, very much in an environment of uncertainty about the duration of the crisis, and some of these measures were very much learning by doing. But what the ILO proposes is a framework that covers 4 key areas. First, stimulating the economy and employment. Second, supporting enterprises, jobs and incomes. Third, protecting workers in the workplace. And last but not least, relying on social dialogue so that everything else is sustainable and has internal and external validity. So as regards to some of the key elements and policy responses that I wanted to discuss with you is the importance of counter-cyclical fiscal policies. These kind of policies, for example, in Europe, were able to mobilize resources to fund youth guarantees that were able to provide different pathways for young people that were not in employment, education, or training, pathways either towards education, towards apprenticeships, or towards subsidized employment. So opening this fiscal space to support young people and your workers is very important. My colleagues shared this morning some information about the importance of investing in the digital and green economies, and we believe this is quite an important element for young people. And just for the sake of time, I would just like to say, as we continue investing in young people, it is important to integrate psychosocial support measures, and so that we can address the impacts of the pandemic on their mental well-being. Thank you so much again for the invitation. I look forward to the discussion.